support the cross-party call by my noble friend Baroness Chakrabarty and others to strike it out. And I urge this whole House to do exactly the same. Thank you.
My Lords, I also support this attempt at standing pot, making the clause stand pot. Sorry for that explanation. So, I support these amendments. But I have got some caveats I want to raise. I read a column in the Guardian newspapers recently in which one high-profile commentator alleged, quote, "The Tories are introducing voter ID purely because they know the people lacking relevant ID are most likely to vote Labour and want to prevent them from voting." And one Labour MP has described it as, quote, "a cynical and ugly attempt to rig the system to disempower the poorest and the most marginalised." I don't believe that at all, although it seems to me those arguments, and we've heard some here, are concrete evidence that cranky conspiratorial thinking is alive and well across left and right. I am not convinced this is a Trumpian plot, an attempt by the Republican Party to take over the Conservatives or anything else. And I think the view that everything's an international sinister plot, and goodness knows I see a lot of that on social media, is in fact itself in danger of fueling a cynicism and a nihilistic distrust in institutions and politics. And we shouldn't necessarily resort to it in order to oppose voter ID. I don't think we need to. I am prepared to take on face value that the Conservative government are trying to fulfil their manifesto pledge to tackle potential voter fraud. And there certainly has been concern about it, but it has largely been confined, as it happens, to postal votes, which are being dealt with separately. But even if I take them in good faith as doing that, they are trying to shore up trust in the electoral system. My problem is, and it's a big problem, the voter ID is a wrong-headed way of doing it. It's likely to backfire and stoke up mistrust, and so I just want to explain a few of those points. The voting system in Britain is the outcome of centuries of struggle and civic engagement, and often indeed class struggle. The degree of trust that allows us as a country to allow citizens to vote on the basis of just showing up and giving your name, and it's as simple as that, is a real success story. And that's something that the government and all of us should be proud of and celebrating. And guess what? There's no evidence that it's being subverted in any way. It is with the same pride that we don't live in a produce your papers society, based on a constant official checks by authorities. It is important to maintain that distinction between citizens and the state. And it's why so many of us campaigned against ID cards in general when the Labour Party tried to bring them in, why so many of us bought vaccine passports more recently, pushed by the government and backed by the opposition, and even fully vaccinated enthusiasts for the jab, such as myself, worried that this was an egregious, divisive encouragement of looking at one's fellow citizens with suspicion by saying you have to show your papers. And now we are, in that context, talking about showing your papers when you go to vote. And it's a barrier in relation to being able to go freely about our business when it's general ID cards, and it's a barrier to be able to go and freely vote when we're talking about voter ID. So it's in that context, I think, that voter ID is not just a technical matter. No matter what method is used, it creates obstacles to voting. I don't think it will lead to mass disenfranchisement, and to be honest, I find it slightly awkward when people say that poorer people and the marginalised will not be able to cope with filling in the forms or getting the ID. I think that potentially is rather patronising. I don't think that's our objection. But imagine what it will do to a bond of trust if you go along to vote and you witness the sight of numerous people being turned away from polling stations. Surely, and we know that people will be turned away because we've seen pilot schemes in which that is indeed what's happened. Now, surely that would put a question mark over those particular electors, as though they were somehow a bit dodgy, when in fact they just have got the wrong paperwork. And then there are other kind of nightmare scenarios that I dread. You just need a handful of local officials, officious jobsworths, overzealously treating voters as though they would be cheats with the paperwork, and chaos will ensue, and anyone who's had to go into a government department and deal with the paperwork will know that that is all completely feasible. And what is more, the more the government doubles down on this, which I just do not understand why it's doing it, the more it sends the message that the voting system itself is a major problem. It gives the misleading impression that there's a large-scale fraud that's going on that needs to be tackled, and it's just so negative, when in fact I think, as I think the noble Baroness Chakrabarti pointed out, there are positive ways that you could be talking about engaging voters, not having this rather negative view that somehow we've got to stop all those people voting who are trying to sneak in and cheat. My lords, democracy is based on trust. At its heart lies the belief that all people should be treated equally at the ballot box, regardless of any social or educational inequality. Outside of voting, that is irrelevant. Your status is irrelevant when you get to that polling booth. The most lowly person is equal to the most high person in the land. Every vote is equal. And that's based on a belief that everyone can be trusted to decide on the future direction of society and trusted to vote in good faith. That's what democracy is all about. When a few, a very, 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 very few bad apples, and as we've heard, maybe only one, according to the evidence, become the focus for a government to reorganise the election practice, or when a greater problem of distrust in democracy, which I think there might well be distrust in democratic institutions that I talked about in the second reading speech, which is a bigger problem, but I don't think this solves it. When that bigger problem of distrust in democratic institutions then gets narrowed down to take the form of a managerial bureaucratic solution, then I fear that democracy itself is going to be damaged. I fear that it will only fuel a climate in which future election results will be open to suspicion and the integrity of the system is undermined. I appeal to those people who agree in principle with this to avoid the cheap sectarianism in making their case, however.